Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. All right, well, Guy, welcome to All Across America. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So you're the coaches for the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Clearly, you didn't start there. You've had a long journey to get where you are, and I know you come from a competitive family. Maybe you can just walk us through your path.
Yes, certainly. So I started off as an archer, and I competed nationally and internationally as an archer. And after the 1996 Olympics, that's really when I was bitten by the Olympic bug, and I was 16 at the time, and decided that I wanted to really try to dedicate my life to trying to make the Olympics as an athlete. And after several Olympic trials, I was unsuccessful there and just narrowly missed the Olympic team several times. And in fact, on my last trials in 2008, it came down to the final arrow of the competition after a year-long trials process.
Oh, man.
And myself and my opponent, we both had arrows that were on the line. And if the arrow is touching the line, it's the higher value. And if it's not, it's the lower value. And the judge determined that my opponent's arrow was touching the line and my arrow was not touching the line. And so I ended up losing that match by 1 point. And that ended up keeping me from making that 2008 Olympic team. Yes.
By a hair, literally.
Literally by a hair, after a year-long process and over 1,000 arrows shot in competition and hundreds of thousands of arrows shot in practice.
Yeah.
But fortunately enough, I had already made the decision that if I made the team or I didn't make the team, that I really wanted to go into coaching because I experienced a lot of frustration as an athlete. And I felt like I couldn't always get the answers that I was looking for from coaches. So I wanted to help athletes avoid that frustration. And literally 2 weeks later, a position opened up as assistant coach at the Olympic Training Center where I had been training as an athlete. And I applied. I was hired. And then a week later, I was coaching many of the athletes that I had been competing against.
Wow.
Yes. And so you can imagine that that was really not successful after this initial honeymoon period.
Yeah.
And I, through that process, I learned a lot about coaching, and I learned that I didn't know a lot about coaching.
Yeah.
And so fast forward several years, I wanted to help coaches avoid the frustration that I experienced as a coach, and then went into coach education as the director of education for coaches and judges with USA Archery at the time. And through that, I was able to, I'd like to think, impact about 20,000 coaches that USA Archery had in their system.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. And then this August of this last year, was hired by the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee as the Associate Director of Coaching to help our national team coaches and coaches that are in that national team pipeline.
And so you've evolved beyond archery to all sports.
To all sports. I work with coaches from a wide variety of sports right now. And we really focus on the coaching skills that are independent of the sport. We're not talking about the technical, tactical side of the sport. What we talk about is the how to coach skills, how to manage a team, how to create a culture, how to sustain a high performance culture. And those types of things that are really going to determine really set the stage for the best sports programs in the world. And that's what we want to do at the US OPC. So
yeah, 100%. Team USA all the way. So I mean, talk about culture. What do you mean by culture? What is good culture, and what is not good culture?
Yeah, so well, it really depends, but I think that when it comes to culture, in a sports organization, what are commonalities with really high performing programs that have a long history of sustained success is what you're gonna see first and foremost is that they've bought into a shared vision or a belief, right? And these are their core values of what they believe. And people know what those are. They're well communicated, and it's not just words that are on a wall, but they have meaning, they have weight.
Yeah.
And the next thing that you really see is a really strong set of behaviors or expectations that happen on a daily basis within that program.
Okay.
And so I think that, um, those two things really set the foundation. And you have to have leaders that are willing to um, hold people accountable to that, but also model those behaviors and those values too.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that those are first and foremost the foundational elements that need to be there. And um, I think when it comes to it as well, like leadership is a really big part of a high performance culture as well. Because the leaders that you have are really going to continue to set the stage, and not just the coaches, but the athletes as well that step up as leaders.
I find that in a lot of professional sports, even college sports, they seem to cycle through coaches. I mean, they just get fired left and right. You hear of, it'd be halfway through a season. Is that bad strategy on the part of the general manager, the president of those teams that, you've tried to set a culture and then you've got a coach that's fired and then you've got a whole new coach that's coming in who could be replaced by another coach, who's got a gun to his head in a year or two.
Yeah, and so I've got a number of thoughts about this, and again, I just want to highlight that I want to be clear that the thoughts that I share here on this podcast today are my views and opinions, and not necessarily representative of the USOPC. When it comes to coaching, and especially the hiring, evaluation, and firing of coaches, I think that a lot of people get some things really mixed up. We see a lot of coaches throughout history that have had success despite not being great coaches. And I'm not talking necessarily in the Olympic realm, but in the professional sports realm is what we see, where we see that. And I think that there is a misunderstanding of how to hire and fire coaches, and of also what is really high performance quality coaching. And I think that when it comes down to it, 99% of the time when a professional coach or a coach at the college level is hired, very rarely does anybody observe that coach actually coaching, which is what they're hired to do. Typically it's based off of an interview or what their success rate was at a previous school or the relationships that they have, not necessarily on what their primary responsibility is. And in the same regards, I think what people view as high performance coaching in those realms is really direct, author- author- authoritative coaching, and not that's not necessarily representative of what research shows as quality coaching, and it's not necessarily leads to long term success. So,
Right. Right.
yeah.
And so, what does research show that leads to quality coaching?
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a vast amount of research now. Research now supports collaborative based coaching. You'll hear this referred to as athlete centered, coach driven approach to coaching. And it's not necessarily, it doesn't mean that we're letting the athletes run the show. It means that there's a collaboration there, and that as the coach, instead of being the center and the sage on a stage, the expert in the room that has all the answers. The coach is really a guide on the side, and they're helping the athlete discover solutions. They're helping the athlete discover the pathway to success. And it doesn't mean that they can't be demanding. It doesn't mean that the coach can't have really high expectations, but it means that it's a collaborative process. And we can really use that to help increase the athlete's motivation and really help the athlete achieve their goals as well as the goals that the coach sees, or that ultimate potential that the coach sees of the athlete.
And how is that different from, let's say, non-professional athletes? I'd imagine it's, you're a little league coach, not about collaboration,
It
or
should
less
be.
so. Slightly
It
less so.
should be.
It
It
should
should
be,
be,
okay.
and this is a fallacy, that people have, and, I help coach my kids' teams. I've coached, soccer, baseball, rugby, and archery, and, I think that people think that you can't ask a six-year-old open-ended questions to help them self-organize and help them come to solutions themselves, or help them piece together a correlation between a pass in soccer and something that they did in school, or that they saw on a cartoon, or their favorite movie, whatever it may be. But they can, and they're actually quite intelligent. And if you can collaborate with all athletes of all ages and all skill levels, then you can really fast track their learning and development as an athlete.
I've that makes a lot of sense. I've heard, so many times about make people feel like it's their idea.
Yes, absolutely.
And so it sounds like it's a little bit of that.
It is, but in order to do that, you have to know the athlete. You have to have an idea of what their self interests are, and you have to be able to. I always say it's kind of like um, the movie Shrek. And there's a point where Donkey and Shrek are talking about ogres, and ogres are like onions, right? And you've got to peel through the layers to get to the core. And to peel through those layers, you've got to really be able to connect with the athlete, and you've got to start more broad and then work your way more specific. But you're kind of guiding that conversation, but it's a conversation. And I think that all coaching should be a conversation.
And how is it different in, you're talking soccer and rugby and baseball, team sports versus individual sports?
I think when it comes down to it, all sports are, whether they're team sports or individual sports, are really similar. Because team sports, athletes they're battling for positions, they're battling for starting time, for playing time, and they want to be the best that they can be. And it's the same thing for an individual sport. And a lot of times, the individual sports, they train in a group environment. So it's not quite a team, but it is an organization or a program. And there's a lot of commonalities between that and a team sport. And so I think that when you look at it, there are probably more similarities than differences.
That makes a lot of sense, and I hadn't thought of it that way, that you are practice I mean, you have a golf team, you have a tennis team, you have a wrestling team, so, yeah, it does make a lot of sense. And so maybe we talk about practice and training and how you approach that. And is there a difference between practice and training? We talk weight training, but basketball practice, maybe there is. I mean, you shoot 1,000 free throws.
Yeah. So I think this is an area that we can continue to educate coaches in to do a better job. And there are coaches that do an outstanding job here in this area, but at the same time, like I I think that there is a difference between practice and training. I think that if you are being really intentional as a coach and assessing where your athletes are, what skills they need to develop, and then planning their training based on that, executing that training, and then reviewing the training afterwards, that's training. If you're going out and you're having the kids, just do what you've always done or do the same drills that you've always done, to me, that's practice.
I see.
And the difference between the 2 is one is intentional development, training is intentional development, whereas practice is, it's shooting from the hip and hoping that the athletes are going to develop, but you don't know if they're developing or not.
So you're saying training is a higher order than practicing.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And it takes more time. It takes more planning ahead of time. It takes an assessment of really looking at where the athletes are and where they need to be, what skills that are need to be developed that encompass that gap, and then really trying to help develop those specific skills through the training to help that athlete grow and be successful.
And so if we could talk maybe about from the athlete side, how can you be, we've talked about being a coach, but how can you be more coachable as an athlete?
Mm. So coachability with as an athlete, even when I look back on my own story as an athlete, I think I could have been a lot more successful if I would have had more of a growth mindset. And I think that a lot of that research that they came out that highlights the importance of a growth mindset wasn't really readily available when I was competing. But um, a growth mindset, you're open to developing and growing. You know that you don't have to be perfect, and that in order to grow, you really have to stretch your capabilities. You have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And that means taking risks. It means getting feedback. It means using that feedback. And, you're not going to necessarily see a performance improvement that day. And I think that that's also a big difference between training and practice is practice, when coaches go out and they run through the same drills with the athletes that they have every day or throughout the season, they see a performance improvement in the athlete at practice. But with training, you don't necessarily see a performance improvement. What you see is learning, you see development, and the performance lag. And ultimately, what you want is that performance to be when it matters the most in competition, not necessarily in practice. And so you go back to this idea of, what can an athlete do to be more coachable? I think that they can have a really open mind to feedback, really listen to what the coach is saying, and try to gain a better understanding of how they can improve, and constantly push their boundaries, their limits as an athlete to grow and develop as an athlete.
I mean, does that also mean embracing failure?
Absolutely, 100%. And that's
Yeah.
hard for me to say because I myself am what I would call a recovering perfectionist. And, it's challenging. But I think that if you think about it throughout our lives, we probably learn the most when we make mistakes or when we've had failure.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
But that's also part of the responsibility of the coach and even the parents, because the words that parents say and how they reinforce what their kids do has an impact on that mindset. So, and Carol Dweck talked about this in her book Mindset, and you know, as a parent, you could say you can reinforce, "Hey, you're really smart," or you could say, "Hey, you did great on that test because you really studied hard and you really worked hard," and really rewarding the effort and highlighting the effort versus a talent that someone may be born with.
Yes, I have heard that, and that's something that I try
Yeah.
to instill, and thank you for the reminder for for my 2 boys. It's really important. Of course, as the school year comes to a close, but, they're still playing sports and baseball continues,
Yep.
so, yeah, I think that's super important. And we talked about, competition versus practicing. I think I've often heard that you wanna practice as though you're or I should say train, forgive me, as if you're in a competition. So when you are actually in a competition, it doesn't seem like it just seems like it's another day.
I would even challenge you to take that a step further. So, and I think it depends too. So, first of all, it depends on the skill level of the athlete. Okay. I think at the root of that statement is you want to be focused in training like you're focused in competition. You want it to matter, but you don't want to do the same thing that you're doing in competition in practice all the time. And this is an area that I think is really important for coaches to understand is the training needs to meet the needs of the skill level of the athlete. And for example, an athlete that's just learning a skill or just learning a new sport, they really need some time to explore that skill or that sport. They need some time to kind of make those mistakes, right? To have some freedom to make mistakes and find some success there. And so, I like to think of it as like you're giving an athlete some bumper lanes. And maybe initially you're not giving them a lot of feedback and they're just trying to develop the skill. Once they start to develop that skill, then the training has to change. The training needs to be geared towards, hey, we need to get this skill really consistent now. And so there's got to be maybe more repetition. The structure of that practice should change a little bit to really help the athlete nail down that skill. And then when that athlete is consistent with that skill, then we can put that into more of a game like or competition like scenario and really test that skill level. And that's where we can even take it a step further and we can make practice harder than or training harder than what the game is. So now the game is really easy.
Right.
And so we can do that by adding a lot of variability. And because variability increases adaptability. And adaptability is, I think, in my mind, one of the key skills that every athlete needs to be really successful at that higher level.
And, so talk about adaptability. I mean, in archery, I would imagine there are less variables than, let's say, football, where the weather can be, 90 degrees or, snow on the ground.
So you'd be surprised, Mark. I think in all sports, there is a lot of variability because in archery, for example, you train outdoors. You compete outdoors in the Olympics. And even though when you go to the competition, you shoot the same distance. And in target archery, you're standing at the same distance the whole time. You're shooting a certain number of arrows under the same timing conditions. Your opponent changes though. The weather changes. In the Olympics, World Championships, major events, in archery, we shoot in large stadiums or smaller stadiums. And the wind is a big factor there because in a stadium setting, the wind will swirl. And if you look at even like the 2012 Olympics, they built a stadium inside of a stadium. We were competing in Lord's Cricket Ground, and then they built a smaller stadium within Lord's that we competed in. And that made a lot of challenges with the weather. And you could have two wind flags at the target side by side going opposite directions of each
Wow.
other the whole time.
That's
Yes.
crazy.
And also, the average heart rate for an athlete competing in the Olympics or world championships in archery, their average heart rate's around 130 to 150 beats per minute.
Wow. I mean, that's intense running.
Yes. And that's while they're standing completely still. And in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics that happened in 2021, the silver medalist for the men, his heart rate reached a high of 174 beats per minute.
Standing still.
standing still, and he still won a silver medal at the Olympic Games.
Wow. And I mean, is that nerves? Is that adrenaline? Like, what's driving that?
Yeah, so I think, it's mainly pressure, right? And that pressure is created by you, but you have a lot of other factors going on there. You have the whole world watching you. You have a stadium that's built around you, and in archery at the Olympics, the stands may be 15 15 feet or 15 yards away from you, so the people are right there. You also have a giant, Megatron on both sides of the targets that, is I think they're about 20 feet tall, and so it projects your face on that screen 20 feet tall while you're competing, and you basically get 20 seconds to shoot your arrow. The average match is over in 9 to 12 minutes,
Wow.
and if you tie, you go into a single arrow, 1 arrow shoot off, and the closest arrow to the center wins. And so your Olympic journey that may take 4, 8, 10, 12 years can be over in 9 minutes at the Olympic Games.
Yeah, I mean, that's heartbreak.
It is. It is. But that's the beauty of the sport, and it makes it really exciting. But all sports, I think, they have a really high level of variability from practice to competition. And I mean, you look at winter sports, the ice is different at every location. The temperature of the ice, the speed of the ice, can all have an impact. The person that goes before you can change the track, or it can change the lay of the ice. It just depends on the sport. Everything is going to have a huge amount of variability, and um, if you don't practice with that variability, what we see is people performing in practice. You can see people that hit world records in practice, but don't come anywhere near it in competition when it matters the most.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny that you mentioned the jumbotron thing. That's actually a psych out technique that they use in football for field goal kickers to put
Right.
their big face on, on 50 feet high. And so here it is, not even doing it as a psych out technique, but just happening organically in the Olympics. And yeah, that would get my heart racing.
Yeah.
So go
I
ahead.
I think I was just gonna say that I think what archery experiences in the Olympics is probably similar to a field goal kicker trying to kick that winning field goal, or a soccer athlete that's gotta take that penalty kick when the game is tied and it's now gone to penalty kicks, and it determines who's going to the next round or wins the World Cup or whatever it may be.
Yeah. So we talked about learning from experiences and learning from failure, and I'm an optimist, but as you said, and I agree 100%, you learn so much more from what you did wrong than what you've done right, and mistakes, is another word for experience. Maybe you could talk about your evolution as a coach and some of the mistakes that you made to make you, the coach that you are today.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I will say real quick too about this, because we talked about it from the athlete perspective before, like having that growth mindset. But I think, and we talked about what parents can do to reinforce that growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. But coaches too, coaches can create an environment where it's safe to make mistakes, where
Yes,
mistakes are part of the training.
psychological
And
safety.
yes, exactly, and even small things that we say, excuse me, like a coach can say, "Hey, I'm really glad you made that mistake. We're gonna get better because of that mistake." Or, "I did the same thing before. It's all right. It's good. We're gonna learn from that." Those little phrases like that can make a really big difference in a young athlete or even an elite athlete, their level of comfortability with making mistakes. Yeah.
Right.
Now, you had asked about me as a coach, like the mistakes that I made and what I learned from that. Well, I think the biggest mistake that I made as a coach was when I went into coaching, I tried to coach the way that I had always been coached. And I grew up in South Texas, and I had some great coaches growing up, but they were very traditional in their approach. And so by traditional, I mean that they were direct. And my generation, we didn't really question coach when they told you to do something. Coach said, "Hey, you need to do this," or "You're doing X, you need to do Y." You didn't you didn't argue with them, you didn't complain about it, you just did it.
Yes,
Um
sir.
Yes, sir, exactly. And, uh, so when I went into coaching, I thought, "Well, I've got this vast amount of experience now as a high performance athlete. Um, I can just coach the same way as I was coached." And all the coach education that I had been a part of up until that point was really focused on the technical, tactical side of the sport, not on how to coach, how to deliver that information. And so, I think after a couple of months, I could really sense athletes starting to just put up a wall every time I would come up to them to tell them, "Hey, you're doing this wrong," or "You need to do it this way instead. And this is why." The younger generation in particular, they wanted to talk about it. They had their own ideas, and I didn't wanna hear their ideas. So I think that was another mistake that I made, was not listening to the athlete enough and giving them a voice. And, for me as a coach, um it didn't really start to hit home until the 2012 Olympics, where the athletes in archery at the time, they would select the coaches that went to the Olympics. And there was only a couple of coaches that would go. But it was just myself and our head coach that worked with the athletes on a daily basis. And I just knew that when the time came that I was going to go to the London Olympics as a coach. And I'll never forget the day that the head coach called me and said, "You weren't selected by the athletes to go to the Olympic Games." And that was pretty hard to take. And I immediately thought, well, these athletes made a huge mistake. And then the following year, we were setting up for a competition, and I had ended up severely hurting and injuring my back. And after that, I was, I think, bedridden for about 4 to 5 months before I had surgery. Fortunately enough, one morning I crawled into surgery and walked out that afternoon. But in that time frame, that 4 to 5 months, I didn't have one athlete call me. I didn't have an athlete text me. I didn't have any athlete come visit me. And it was like I didn't even exist to them. And so when you're in that situation, you have a lot of time to reflect. And um,
Yeah.
I think for myself, I realized that I didn't listen to the athletes, that I was really direct with them, and I wanted to find another way. So I started researching as many different things as I could. I started to apply for different coach programs that were non-sport specific. And fortunately enough, I went through one, um, and it was a 2.5 year program, and it made a vast difference in who I was as a coach. I um, really learned that emotional intelligence is really critical for coaches to be successful, and especially awareness of yourself and awareness of other people. And so after that, I really tried to communicate to athletes differently based on how I knew they like to communicate. The athletes that were more direct, I would be direct. The athletes that needed more of a relational side, I tried to offer that. And I really started to try to listen to the athletes. Um, and so I think that those are some really important things when it comes to coaching and making an impact with people.
But, and that's that resilience right there and learning from that and, not wallowing in misery but taking it I mean, I'm sure in reflecting it's tough and I can only imagine having been in that situation
Mm.
and, not hearing from people and, but, you took it and made it into obviously a huge, huge positive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a real turning point for me in my life as well,
Yeah.
because I could have just I could have quit what I was doing. I
Yeah.
could have found something else. Um, I was I really believed that if I did, I was gonna run into the same problem somewhere along the lines because I felt like a lot of coaching is leadership as well, and learning how to work with people and and be a good not just a good leader, but a good teammate. And, um, so before that, I think that I wasn't really vulnerable with my athletes or with people in general. And, uh, I think if you really wanna embrace a growth mindset, you have to be vulnerable. You have to be vulnerable at least with yourself and willing to listen to, "Hey, yeah, I made some mistakes, but am I gonna learn from them or am I just gonna keep making those same mistakes?"
Yeah, I mean, you can't grow unless you think you can grow. You can't learn if
Yeah,
you think you know everything, you can't learn. I mean, it's, I think, unfortunately too simple.
that's right.
So
Yeah.
can we talk about, how the concept of how to coach versus what to coach?
Mm. Yeah, so the difference between how to coach versus what to coach. Well, John Wooden said that they I'm gonna butcher this, but I just had this up from a course I was working on, but John Wooden said something along the lines of they they haven't learned it, you haven't taught it until they've learned it. Okay? And the point there is coaching isn't about delivering information. Coaching is about getting someone else to learn. And even when we talk about sports, it's about learning. Skills are motor learning, right? Physical skills are motor learning. And we've got to get people to learn. And if you don't understand how people learn, you're going to struggle as a coach. And the truth is, we all have opportunities to coach people. Whether you think you're a coach or not, we all have opportunities to influence, impact, motivate people. And so the more you know about that, the better you're going to be. Up until I would say probably 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of coaching on how to coach. Most um, most coach education programs that I saw were very sport specific and focused on what to coach. And what to
Mechanic.
coach is the technical, tactical side of the sport, even some of the psychological skills that they may need specifically for that sport. But it's the mechanics, right? It's, hey, in baseball, when you're pitching, you want your hand in this position and your body doing this, and this is how you want to finish the follow through. Um, or hey, these are the plays that we're going to run, and this is the formation, and these are the route. That's the technical, tactical side of things. And I think when coaches get caught up on only teaching those things, they will typically see athletes that are very dependent on them and on coaching. But we want to create athletes that are almost, I wouldn't say independent, but athletes that can think on their own, that they can perform without having to overthink and over try in competition.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the how to coach skills, these include even basic skills, how we demonstrate things, how we explain things, right? To the more, I would say, more advanced skills of, hey, how do we? have a coaching conversation with an athlete versus how do we just tell them what they're doing wrong. And I think direct feedback is a very small part of how we provide feedback. Um, how we set up a training session, or how we create an activity that is going to help an athlete learn a specific skill. Those are really to me, the how to coach skills that are really important.
And, I think you've described it as when we were, corresponding back and forth before the podcast, I had mentioned that I was a golf caddy for many years, and, I would see these guys get up there and, they had the last 6 shot doctors, and one of them was telling them where to position their elbows, and another thinking about their wrists, and another guy was telling them about their legs, and so, they've got these 6 different, voices swirling in their heads, and inevitably they, shank it off into the woods, and, rather than thinking about just the follow through. And I think you've described it as, envision the arrow going through the target rather than making the athlete think about those mechanics, the precise position of every body part.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of this is centered around research in motor learning, and especially the work from the optimal theory of motor learning that Gabrielle Wolf and Rebecca Lethwaite put together. Um, that that research in itself encompasses quite a bit of the how to coach skills that coaches can really embrace to make a big difference in how they coach athletes, so that they're not overwhelmed with these 6 different voices, and um, as they're trying to make a movement or execute a skill that should look natural to a certain degree. It should look like it's really repeatable and well executed. You're not going to be able to do that with all these different voices in their head. And you talk about your kids playing little league and stuff. Like my sons play baseball, and I see great coaches, and I see coaches that can learn a lot to help their athletes. Um, you know, there. I think first and foremost, there's this thing called information overload, right?
Yeah.
And when an athlete is stepping up to execute in competition or under pressure, so for example, when a kid is stepping up onto the plate, at the plate to bat, and you've got a coach at third base that's telling him uh, 10 different swing mechanics right before every pitch, and what they're doing wrong, they're not going to be successful, or they're not going to be as successful as they could be. And so I think that knowing those skills is really important. And if we go back to the optimal theory of motor learning, like, one of the big things there is intrinsic motivation, and understanding intrinsic motivation, because it has an impact on learning and it has an impact on performance. And we can boost intrinsic motivation by a couple of ways. So one is increasing autonomy. So autonomy is giving the athlete choice. And this is true for beginners, and it's true for elite athletes. We can give athletes some choice, then we can see a positive increase in their ability to learn skills, retain those skills day in and day out, and perform when it matters the most. And so, ways that I like to give athletes autonomy is, whenever I try to give feedback, instead of giving them direct feedback, I might ask them open ended questions. Hey, Mark, tell me about your golf swing here. Okay. What do you notice at this point of the swing? Oh, okay, great. What would that look like if we were going to be successful there? Or what's the challenge there? And you might say, well, the challenge is I got all these thoughts going through my head. I don't know what to think about. Okay. Well, if we could pick one, which one would make the biggest impact on you and help you have a really smooth swing, a really powerful swing, you know? and I might get you to describe what success looks like, and then we're going to help you find a solution together. But because I've asked you questions and you have given your feedback, you've said it in your words, now you have some autonomy, you have some choice. I can even say, okay, what what does that remind you of? And you might say, oh, it reminds me of this other activity I did, or how I hit a baseball, and so we might use that. We might say, okay, we're going to use that as a cue. And that's another part of that optimal theory of motor learning is external focus. External focus boosts learning, retention of skills, performance under pressure, and fluidity in movement. And so between um, increasing intrinsic motivation and autonomy and external focus, we can really accomplish a lot with coaches and to have better help the athlete.
I mean, and that sounds like, and as you were saying, can translate to so many facets of life, whether it's at work or, I don't know, relationships.
Absolutely. I mean, it really. I use some of these same skills in helping my kids with their schoolwork, or helping them even want to do their chores. Right. So if you ask a kid to go clean their room, they're not going to be interested in it. Right. But if or tell them they're going to clean the room, like they're not going to be motivated to do that. They're going to drag their feet. They may get it done once, but if you collaborate with them, and you say, "All right, n- what would you collaborate on that with them on why it would be important for them to clean their room, or when they would like to clean their room." Even giving them small choices can have a really big impact on intrinsic motivation. And so, and this is also why if you say, "Hey, I challenge you. I bet you can't do this in 6 minutes." They say, "Yeah, you wanna bet?
I know
I can do it in 5 minutes."
that.
"Okay, you wanna do it in 5 minutes?" Now you've given them choice. Now they have intrinsic motivation, and now they're gonna they're gonna go clean their room, right?
I I'm laughing because that's a technique I've employed with great success with my kids. I pull out my iPhone and put the timer on. They're like, "They're on it." The competitive nature and it's worked well for me. I've got a lot to learn as a parent, but um
We all do, right? We all do. As a parent, every day is a learning
yeah, it sure
opportunity.
is.
Yeah.
You had mentioned John Wooden, who is, of course, one of the most winningest, if not the winningest, coaches in college basketball history, with a long tenure at UCLA. And I was just reading an article about the longtime softball coach at UCLA, whose mentor was John Wooden. She referred to him as Papa Wooden,
Yep.
and she talked about resiliency. And on her team, when somebody would make an error, they they would be able to move on really quickly by saying, "My bad," tapping their chest twice, and boom. And that was it. How do you work with athletes and thinking about resiliency and overcoming those errors?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it comes back to your values and expectations, and if you can make that as part of your expectations, I think that can be really, really powerful, especially if you're consistent with highlighting those expectations. Um, one one sport that I went and observed, this past year was, Texas A&M's basketball team. And, um, I I'm, I've been a fan of Buzz Williams, he's gone on to Maryland now, University of Maryland, as their basketball coach. But one of their team kind of expectations and values is to always tell the truth, um, no matter the emotional state, dot, 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 lies destroy families. And I think that's the way that they state it. All the athletes on that team know team rule number one, and they can all recite it word for word with the correct punctuation. All the coaches can. And they referred to it within multiple times within their practice, referred to team rule number one. And what I saw was every time a coach gave feedback or had a question and the athletes discussed something and they came to a solution, everybody would clap. And it was just kind of a ritual, if you would say, of, hey, we heard the feedback, we're going to use that feedback.
Yeah.
We acknowledge it versus you don't, a lot of times with feedback, if it's especially direct, you don't know if an athlete's going to use it or not. They may say, yes, got it, but you don't know if they're actually buying into it
Yeah,
or if they
yeah,
actually know.
yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that when it comes to resiliency, like, again, if this is part of your expectations, your values as a program, and you highlight it and you create even training activities that are going to reinforce this, then I think you have a really high probability of the athletes buying into that, the athletes developing and growing in that space, and really not just going through the motions, but embracing it. You know.
Can you talk about something that you've termed constraints-led approach?
Mm, yeah. So constraints led approach is it's a non-linear pedagogy of coaching or teaching, right? It's and that's, if you think about it, that's how we learn. We don't learn in a straight path. And a lot of times people think that, especially learning or athlete development, is a straight path up 45 degrees. And that's not really how it happens. You have these peaks, you have valleys, you have these misdirections, and then you get back on path. And so with the constraints led approach is, I like to think of it as using bumpers or guidelines. We're going to use, it's like bowling. We're going to put some bumpers down the alleyway here to keep your ball within this general area. And within those boundaries, you're going to explore some different solutions and find the solution that works best for you. And I think the beauty in the constraints led approach is that it gives athletes autonomy. It is a very athlete centered approach to learning and development because the athlete has choice. They can choose what they take away from an experience. Okay. And from that, they can self organize, they can find their own solutions, they can use their own language to describe those solutions or their own experiences. And, I think when it comes down to it, us as coaches, we can't necessarily take that away from the athlete. And I think earlier I said that even really young athletes, 5, 6-year-old athletes, they have other experiences in their life that they can connect the dots. And that's going to really fast track the learning. And so with a constraints led approach, that's basically what we're doing. We're giving the athlete an opportunity to explore. And then with constraints themselves, we can think of those as, hey, we're going to limit the options. Okay. So the athlete doesn't have infinite options.
The
Maybe they have
tyranny of
3 or
choice.
4 or 5 options, right? Or 2 options to choose from. And those options that we limit, or the different constraints that we may apply, that can be task constraints. So we can modify what the activity is and how the activity is executed. We can modify the individual. So we can put a constraint on the individual. And then we might even modify the environment, right? So we may change. Examples of each one of these are the task. Okay, so we may change to a small-sided game. Okay, so in soccer, we may play on half the field or a quarter of the field to be able to practice, say, passing in tight spaces. Okay, we can change the individual. We can tie the athlete, not necessarily tie their athlete's hands behind their back, but we can limit the movement of their arms or of one arm,
Wow.
or we can put them into a tighter space. or a bigger space. And then we could also um, modify the environment, right? So we can change the lighting, we can change the wind, we can change if we're in a big stadium full of people or no stadium. There's a lot of different ways that you can look at this. But one of the key things here too is that we want to um, there needs to be some representativeness to the actual practice. And I think the difference between a constraints led approach and drills, as most coaches like to use, is that a drill is a one size fits all. It's,
Right.
hey, this is the way that this is executed, this is the solution. And a constraints led approach is, hey, we're giving you some options. You're going to find the solutions that are going to work best in those situations.
It's so fascinating that you talk about options and that and I'm thinking of, a book, and it's called Verbal Judo, and it's a technique for law enforcement professionals and, trying to persuade without resorting to, force for people to do what is required of them, and one of the key things is to provide people with options, and that way they feel in control, and it's just amazing. I knew this, but it's amazing hearing from you how much this coaching technique reflects, all facets of life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it applies again to how we learn skills and how we execute skills under pressure. Yeah. And a constraints-led approach also it increases variability. And so even in a technique sport and a sport like archery, if you really analyze the mechanics of what's happening shot from shot, there's always an extreme amount of variability. And to the naked eye, you may not see it, but in with shooting outdoors in the wind, you're always aiming in a slightly different place, compensating for the wind. You have different pressure on you. Your heart rate is different. The sun is different. All these things are always changing, and so we need to be able to train that variability into us. It's very small, but we've got to be able to execute with the variability.
Can we talk for a minute just about, the sports psychology, and, you were talking about this one athlete having a heartbeat of 174 beats per minute. How does an athlete in that situation steady themselves? Like, what's going through their minds? What techniques are they using?
Mm. Well, I can't comment on that athlete specifically, but I think that there are a lot of different options available to athletes. And depending on the athlete, they may use a different strategy. But obviously, there's breathing strategies that you can use. And I'll give you an example of an athlete that I work with, and she under pressure, um, definitely, I will just say that all athletes. Let's back up, okay? Let me rephrase that here. Uh, I just want to think about how I want to phrase this. Okay, so I'll give you an example. I work with an athlete, and it became apparent in working with that athlete that in competition they needed some strategies to manage um, their arousal level and where the heart rate was and just their ability to think clearly. And so one strategy that we used was exploring some different breathing strategies. And again, this is kind of incorporating that constraints led approach. So I had the athlete explore a couple of different breathing strategies and then identify which one of those breathing strategies they felt most comfortable with.
Gotcha.
And then from there, we even had them explore modifying that breathing strategy or a couple of those breathing strategies to better enhance her ability to regulate her heart rate, to regulate her thinking and feel more calm and centered. And from that, she was able to kind of identify a couple of different strategies that she may use in different scenarios throughout a competition. So I think breathing is really important, and it's also an area that breath work is an area that not just athletes are really focusing on using those strategies, but also coaches have been using breathwork strategies as well. Um, you know, there's also the typical visualization, mental imagery, um, and then external focus cues. We go back to Gabrielle Wolf's research in the optimal theory of motor learning. External focus cues really enhance learning, but also performance under pressure. And they simplify things and give people something specific to focus on to execute uh, simple or complex tasks. Okay. An example of an external cue may be there's close external cues. That could be like the sleeve of your shirt, anything outside the body. Far external cues, which may be the trajectory of a ball or the trajectory of an arrow or even a focal point. And then there's also analogous cues, which are basically analogies. So, hey, I want you to uh, follow through like you are breaking a board in karate. It can be something like that, a visual. Um, or I want you to stand like this. And those things like that, those, especially I think analogies, they help athletes um, get a really quick picture of something that they need to do and be able to execute that. And they're fun, right? And so if the athlete even chooses the analogy, then now you've incorporated intrinsic motivation into it as well. So now you've got a double dose of
Double dose. Yeah.
boost in performance and learning. So
Well, it's midway through 2025. We've got the Winter Olympics coming up pretty soon in 2026, and then of course Summer Olympics in 2028. What are your thoughts on that? And will you be attending?
um so 2026 Olympics is really exciting. I think that Milan Cortina is going to be an awesome experience. I hope to be there supporting Team USA. I do work with a couple of winter sports programs right now, so I'm really looking forward to seeing how they perform there and just what they learn. And the 2028 Olympics is going to be amazing being on U.S. soil again. And then also
Yeah.
after that, we will be having the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City as well.
Right. Right.
So we have an exciting next 10 years or so in the U.S. in with Olympics. And I think that anytime you have an Olympics on home soil, it's really a remarkable experience, especially for those athletes to be able to experience that and have their families, their friends, their support systems there, and be able to cheer for them and give us a home field advantage. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when it was last in LA, what, 1984?
1984, yes,
And then Lake Placid before that in 1980. So it's like here we are 45 years later and it's coming
yeah.
back full circle. So that's going to be an
Well,
exciting time.
yeah, we did have the Winter Olympics in Park City in
That's right. Yeah.
2002.
Well, anything you want to leave people with? Any, major takeaways, most important takeaways?
So one thing I'd like to just leave people with is this: is 3 minutes a day. 3 minutes a day is the difference between who you are today and the person you're meant to be tomorrow. And whether you are a leader, a coach, uh, or you just consider yourself a normal person, right? we all have a potential to reach. And the only way that we get that is spending 3 minutes a day reflecting on what we did, what we wanted to happen, what actually happened, and what we're going to do differently next time, and then taking that forward. And the more we can reflect on that every day, the more that we're going to continue to grow and be better. And that's going to have a huge impact in our life. So,
Excellent. Words to live by.
yeah.
Well, Guy, it's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Mark. I enjoyed it. And yeah,
Go Team USA.
go Team USA. Yeah.
All right. All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.